Nothing is getting cheaper in the next year or two. Everything that you purchase will become more expensive. You should expect higher costs of all of the services in the business. I think that's probably the safest way to think of this, right? But it will also create huge opportunities. Welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Today I've got my good friend and counterfoil, Sachin Patel. We are talking about geopolitical risks and how they may play out in your general practice and what you can do to address them. Sachin, we are not a finance or a political show. I feel like I'm David Packman or one of the commentary people today, but we're going to get to addressing some of this stuff because it's a pretty big deal, and obviously the effects are showing up locally in a lot of different ways. But let's get to it. When I say geopolitical risks that are impacting general practice in our communities, what are the things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I'll just start it by just saying heartfelt thoughts are going out to anyone affected directly or indirectly by the conflicts that are playing out at the moment. Obviously, there's multiple different conflicts in the world, but there's one that is going to take the news much more than anything else and is having these effects, which is in the Middle East. So in terms of the risks and how we think about this, I like a good table and stratifying. And so the way I think about it is for the owners of a practice, then the practice itself as an entity, then the staff and team, really, and then the patients. And so if we start at the owner's level, that's where we do most of our work. Of course, across all these layers, there's going to be personal concerns for those who have loved ones in the region, wherever they're located. When you're this far away, we've had members of Project X whose family members have been directly impacted by the conflict, and that really takes a big drain on personal energy and resources because you can't help worrying about your loved ones. And so we need to be aware who in our team, including ourselves, might be affected by that. So there's that side. And then separate to that, from an owner's perspective, I think personal costs are likely to rise. We know you've spoken, and I'm sure you'll share a bit more about this. I wasn't here around the GFC, but we're seeing inflation inevitably will rise. As we're recording this, the predictions are it will go above 5%, maybe higher. Off the back of that, the RBA will inevitably raise rates, even though that may not solve the cause. That's the one thing they have in their armory to try and suppress inflation, and that's one of their key mandates. And so from a personal owner's perspective, there could be pressures from the financial side personally. Keen to hear your thoughts on that aspect.
Yeah, so again, I'll preface this with this isn't a finance podcast. However, it does feel like 2007. So sharing with you before we jumped onto the podcast that I remember that the inflation of goods was such that any construction project was having a repricing every 3 months or so, just because the raw materials were going up at such a rate that you couldn't commit to a build that took a year, and having steel and all of the other raw materials that went into that just being accepted at the price at the start of the contract. And I think we're going to see a similar thing, even just the transport costs being added on to everything else. There'll be disruptions to global shipping, as you'd expect. There are a lot of raw materials that contain petrochemicals, hydrocarbons, and so those will all go up. I saw a Reese Plumbing letter that went out that said that PVC piping was going up by 30%. And so you're just going to see inflation in a lot of areas, and it's not a demand side problem. So demand side problems are relatively easy to fix because you quash demand through increasing interest rates. This is a supply shock like what we saw early in COVID. We just can't get the things that you want, and so they're in scarce supply. And then you see people start to behave weirdly. If ever I wished I had a TV where I could reach in and punch people, is probably not a good perspective on myself. But seeing idiots fill up, like often tens of jerry cans with fuel in places just because they suspect there might be a coming shortage. It was like the debacles around toilet paper and kind of just people running in and grabbing things early on. And whilst that might feel good as an individual, as a provider for your family, all they really did was pull forward the supply chain and then have shortages for everybody. So you sort of end up with these distortions that relate to human behaviors around, looking after the community versus looking after themselves. Anyway, in the end, Sachin, I think the way this all plays out is that the RBA only has one tool. It's interest rates. Their job is to keep inflation down. Unfortunately, that's their remit. And the belief is that high inflation is harmful. And so we need to do whatever we can to quell it. And I expect you'll see really high interest rates. So what does that mean? Well, it means a few things. It means that now is probably not a great time to massively expand debt. And I want to give a small little asterisk and caveat to this. There will be projects that there's always a perverse reality in life is that when money is more expensive, what you buy with the money is cheaper. So what I mean is, say properties will be less expensive to buy because people usually stay away from things like that during times of uncertainty and when the economy is cooked and when the confidence is low in the outcomes. So it's actually not a bad time to buy things, and it's not a bad time to do things like fit outs and things like that, because you'll find that the availability of those services is greater, and usually they're less expensive, as in the net cost, the holding cost is higher, so the interest cost is higher. But that will change over time. So if you have a 10-year mindset on anything that you do, and if you're doing a fit out, pretty well you're paying it off over 10 years. If you're buying a property, then 25 years should be the timeline you're looking at. So when you're doing things with the right timeline, everything gets easier, but you're just going to have a period of time when you need to have a good buffer. You might need to work a bit harder to put a little bit of extra money aside to pay for those things. So when everybody else is fearful, Warren Buffett used to say, be greedy. And when everyone else is being greedy, be fearful. I think this is about greed. Greed's not a great word, but when he said that, all he was meaning was when people are uncomfortable taking action, it may be the right time to take action. So as an owner, I think you've got to be clear on your strategy and the reasons why, but you should expect higher holding costs. You should expect higher costs of all of the services in the business. Nothing is getting cheaper in the next year or two. Everything that you purchase will become more expensive. I think that's probably the safest way to think of this, right? But it will also create huge opportunities.
Absolutely. Being strategically contrarian is what you're talking about, not just acting sort of at a brainstem level, but just strategically. If your buffers are in place and opportunity is there, then it may be a time to act when others are in pause mode, because opportunities arise that others are scared of taking. And so there's an opportunity there to be strategically contrarian, zig when everyone else is zagging in that way. So that's what I had, the owner's layer. Then I thought of it.
Before we move to the next one,
Yeah.
what's sometimes a consequence of this sort of circumstance? The GPs will come to the owners and ask for something. What are they going to come to the owners and knock? You're an owner, you're sitting there, you're thinking, geez, it's getting a bit hard at the moment. All the prices for running the business are going up. The GP is sitting in their room thinking, oh, geez, it's getting a bit hard at the moment. All of my personal costs are going up. You're sitting in your room, knock, 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 knock. The door opens. What's the GP going to say?
Yeah. Can you raise my percentage? Like reduce my service fee? That conversation will certainly happen as people feel the pinch. There's like this lack of awareness that the pinch is felt by many, and often it may be felt more by the owner because their costs are higher and their costs are for their staff and their people and all the products in the practice. And so, yeah, I think we've got one of our episodes on that, which we'll link in the show notes about how to manage that conversation. But yeah, I think you can very much expect that. And that's why when we get to the solutions today, that may head off some of that if we go about the ways to address the current situation internally and with your patient base. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So that's probably the owner's part. Next is at the practice layer. So at the practice layer, I see the practice is an entity, not a human, of course, even though we might treat it like our baby. At the practice layer, I think we're going to see, obviously, costs go up in terms of maybe if we've got rent renewals coming, that may be affected. If normal consumables, lots of any equipment we're buying, all of those costs, as you talked about before, that are affecting people individually will definitely affect the business. Consumables, without a doubt, will go up, and you can expect some scarcity of availability. Good opportunity, in brackets, to review your stock ordering and trim, of course. So we see that. Then with staffing, there's potential issues with, especially, and I think where you're located may affect this more. So I suspect rural will be affected more than regional, which would be more affected than urban. But what you can expect or start to be thinking about is that transport and transport costs will mean it might be harder for staff to get there. And so you may have some struggles filling rosters. And at the same time, I think as costs are going up, there's also the risk of more gaps appearing in the appointment book. Some people have already been asking that in online fora. We're a mixed billing practice. What are you doing about gaps? Or have you noticed more gaps coming? That's not unusual to notice that. So obviously, we need to be thinking about if revenue's reducing and costs are going up, mitigating each of those. So we need to be acutely aware of that. They're probably the key things I've got from a practice point of view. How about you?
Yeah, I think from a practice perspective, I'd be thinking about, and we'll talk a bit about this in the ways that we address it, but, people are doing really short shifts, 3 to 4 hours, but they might have a weekly budget of 20, 25 hours. So I'd be thinking more seriously about saying, hey, listen, is it going to make more sense for you to do 3 8-hour shifts rather than 5-hour shifts over the week, just to see if you can maximize the return on travel for them? Even just raising these things with people, saying, look, you might be finding that the fuel costs are going up and that's impacting your ability to fund work and everything else you need to do. How can we help you? That's going to be a really important conversation to have. So they're probably the main ones. A lot of the others, you don't have a lot of influence over them, insurances and things like that. It's sort of like when inflation's a problem, insurance companies go, you know what, we'll just jump on board as well. And you're not going to see the MBS adjust in an appropriate manner. It never does. And so a lot of people will be tempted into thinking, oh, you know what we might do is go back to bulk billing. And you're just kicking the can down the road a little bit. So you're going to have less gaps in your day, but you're going to bill less overall. And then you're going to end up just in this sort of hamster wheel where you're doing really short consults, because long consults, if you do them, they just don't pay. And so you're going to end up sort of having to make changes to the way that you work that you don't really like, that were forced upon you by a knee-jerk reaction. So I think the key thing is, with all this stuff, just think really slow about the strategic impact. I always like the Keith Cunningham framework for this, which is only 4 questions. But, the question is, if you're thinking about a strategic decision, what's the upside? That's easy because that's usually the thing that's on your mind anyway. What's the downside? And that takes a little bit more time, because you have to naturally work against the optimism that most entrepreneurs are imbued with. And then the next question is, can I live with the downside? And that takes a little bit longer to really understand the second and third order consequences of any decision and whether you can live with that. And then the last question is, what is it I don't know? Now that causes you to speak to other people and get some context from elsewhere, because you obviously by definition don't know what you don't see. So this is all about your blind spots. And so, people that are in a community like Project X have a massive advantage here, because they've got content, coaching, and community, so they can collaborate on all of these things. That was nice, Sachin. I got 4 C's in one thing. I expect at least some low-level applause from you.
Gold star. And then we come to staff, right? So staff, I think there's going to be personal issues with the staff. Obviously, if they have connections to the region, that's one. When I say staff, I mean staff and non-employed team. So anyone under the roof, GPs, allied health, etc. We know there's a lot of IMGs, and many have links to those areas or have family members who may have migrated to those areas for work. So I think that's going to be one. Also with the news, the American leadership is quite good at sort of being quite widespread over the news. And so there can be a lot of news fatigue, and that can take a toll on people and be quite traumatizing, angering, triggering, whatever word it is. And I think a compound effect of that, it's probably been very few days if you've opened or looked at a news site that you won't have seen American leadership on there. I use that word lightly, since January 25. And so that can have take its own toll on people, especially when they care. So there's those personal effects. Then I think we've talked about costs. So for staff as well, costs will rise. Inflation will have an impact on team members. There's fear of the unknown, and none of us know the answer to this. Will this become a global conflict? Could I get drafted? These are genuine fears that people are carrying right now when you have conversations. And then I think interest rates we're seeing, we can expect will rise for all of us. And so people who have mortgages, etc., may exhibit or experience financial difficulty. And so we need to be considering that. In those times, people may look for higher paying roles, and higher paying roles can show themselves in two ways: higher pay or different working conditions, which require less transport, work from home, or the ability to piggyback transport with someone else. So that there's things to be considering there. People may look for a second job, and so there may be an opportunity to sort of modify the way we're thinking about things. The other consideration with staff is that we don't know how long this will last and where this will go, but there may be a consideration that practice hours are altered in terms of physical hours, and you just need to be thinking about these things just in case, not to actually do it right now, but there are considerations where rather than being a 5-day open, 2-day closed practice, it might be the other way around. We have 2 days of physical examination and do everything else telehealth and just save the examination for a certain period of time, or change your opening hours. There's lots of potential ways to modify and mitigate this, and we just need to be thinking about that because that may actually allow people to continue to do their work just in a slightly different way. And we need to be adaptive, as we learned 6 years ago when we had the pandemic. So that's probably from a staff point of view. Did you have anything from there?
Yeah, I think you're right, Sachin. It may be that if everybody agrees that they would like more opportunities to earn money, then extending hours and providing more services to your existing patient cohort makes a lot of sense. Going deeper in your community, those services being offered by financially engineered businesses that don't really have any deep connection with your patients anyway. And so asynchronous and synchronous care could be expanded here. You could do some work in the evenings. People could decide the times they want to work on telehealth. You could open the business on the weekends. So you could do a 5-hour shift, something like that, which is usually convenient for staff and GPs. That might be enough that it staves off all of those extra overheads. And the extra work that people seek is actually within your clinic and providing extended services to your community. You get better rebates for working on a Sunday. You could run your flu clinics on Sundays. They don't interfere with your normal weekly cadence. There are a lot of opportunities here. And you were talking about invoking the sort of COVID level. Okay, let's not waste this crisis. This is going to be painful and for a while. It's not going to be over despite what some of our less than exalted leaders are telling us. It's not going to be over in a short period of time. Even if it was fixed tomorrow, the disruptions will last for months. And so the reality is we're better to prepare for a long haul and sustained levels of high inflation. If you're ready to do this for 12 to 18 months and it ends up being 6 months, well, then that's awesome. If you think this is a 2-week to 4-week thing and it ends up being 16, 18 months or longer, then you're probably going to be knackered by this. So what I'd suggest is that people adopt the brace position and that they get ready and they get highly aligned with their team about who they're about, who they serve, and how they plan to do that, and go really deep on it and include that messaging in the way that you talk to your community through your socials, emails, etc. Really make sure that the people in your team that are your A graders, your objective is to keep them through this time, just as it was through COVID. And that can only be done through collective solutions. And so this is not a time for prescribing things. You might propose, suggest, and collaborate with the team, and then run some experiments and see if everyone gets what they need out of it. But I'd certainly be calling an all-hands meeting and walking through the likely scenario and how that impacts the communities, the patients, the team under the roof, and the ownership, and just walking through all the things that people have on their mind. Much better if your team produce an idea that was already in your head than you talking about it and presenting it to them, because the buy-in is that much higher.
Absolutely. And then I suppose we come to the patients, which is really why we all exist, is to serve the patients. So from this point of view, all the things we've talked about up until here, costs, interest rates, we've talked about having loved ones in the region and being affected, all of that is applicable to patients. And then I think the transport stuff we talked about, like getting to and from a practice, is obviously going to be a concern for those that are struggling with increased fuel costs or potentially laid off from work or those types of things. And I think, again, that may disproportionately affect practices that are more rural and regional, because transport links are a bit harder there. And then I think the things we need to be thinking about are obviously mental health needs, react to sort of mental health conditions rising on the back of the fallout of all these factors that we've talked about. And then I think the biggest risk here is really people withdrawing from their sort of preventative health type things, or even stopping meds or stopping treatment for things that they don't really feel. So you don't feel blood pressure normally. You may not feel diabetes. And so it might be easy just to trim down or stop certain meds. And so there is a bit of a risk, I think, of some acute conditions rising. And so we need to think about how we mitigate that as a practice. This is where general practice is way ahead of all the doctors, doctors, and other services, because and this is the ability for general practice to really stand strong because we have the power to reach out to those people. We have the trusted relationships. And so notwithstanding all the financial stuff, I think we exist here to keep people healthy, and we are the most efficient and effective part of the health service. Our job is not to wait for patients to come to us with problems. Our job is to make sure that those preventative things we're right on top of it. And, I've told the story before, but I'll tell it again because it just exemplifies, my wife's uncle in the pandemic, the practice switched to telehealth, diabetic hypertensive, and he stopped his antihypertensive. Hadn't had any outreach from the practice, thought they were, too busy with COVID, so didn't want to contact them. Anyway, stopped his antihypertensives, had a hemorrhagic stroke, and was permanently paraplegic from that. And so completely avoidable. I think this is a really important sort of conversation to have internally, that come what may, regardless of all the pressures that we're on financially or otherwise, this is where we're going to show the strength of what we do as general practice, and we're not let our patients just float in the wind. We're going to reach out to them and be really proactive about how we go about things. I think that's really important, and it really shows the strength and power of general practice. Is where we can shine. And so I think it's an opportunity. You said it earlier, never waste a crisis. It's an opportunity. We may not get, plaudits from anyone else, but nothing beats yourself and your team knowing what a good job you've done. There's great power in that. And so I think that's really important to address with our teams. Anything from you?
Yeah, I think, Sachin, the way I look at this is it's really easy to lead when it's easy. Like, that's not actually leadership. It's like sailing a ship when the waters are calm. The only time that people really give a shit is when you demonstrate leadership when the going is tough and it's really difficult out there. And you step out and you say, you know what? I know it's shit for everyone. These are the problems that we identify that people might be having, and this is how we're going to help in fixing them. That you want to be known for that. So you want your team, everybody under that roof, and your community. And so that extends beyond your patients, just to know that that practice really gives a shit. They know what they're doing. They're talking about stuff that people are thinking about before anybody else is talking about it, and just being really pragmatic and practical about the solutions that you offer people. I think that's the way to look at this. And then if you can look after your team through this time as well, a lot of the time in business, we should be thinking about, how do I build a moat around my business that protects me from other businesses stealing, my intellectual property, my team, my patients? How do I build moats around that? Well, this is the time to go and build that moat, because everybody else will be thinking, shit, I know things aren't good, but I don't really want to talk about it because my staff are going to ask for more money. The GPs are going to ask for a higher percentage. I don't have the money to give them, so I'd rather not open that conversation. That's what most people are probably thinking. Instead, you need to be thinking, okay, people have a lot of stuff on their mind at the moment. I need to hear it all because I'm not going to have assumed correctly in this, and we just need to get it out. You don't need to actually fix it or address it there and then, but you do need to hear it all. And so I might get you to walk through a process that we teach in Project X called a whiffle, just so as that people listening would go, okay, now I know what I might do.
Absolutely. So I'll just step back a bit and I'll talk through that. So I think there's 3 key things that we need to do. So communicate, number 1. So that's internally and externally. And we need to do that well, consistently, and way more than you think you need to do it. Number 2, we then need to provide support. So that will come in different ways, and it will be co-created or collaboratively created with the team. But there'll be internal supports, and then there'll be external supports to our community and patient base. And that will look different depending on whether you're urban, regional, rural, and the spread of the community and patients that you serve. And then the third is outreach. I think that's super important. both to our internal team individually and to patient base, as we talked about earlier. I think this all starts at one simple place, Todd, which is what you're asking about, which is we need to get the team together and we do something called a whiffle, what I feel like expressing. And the way I like to do it is have a whiteboard or some sort of, maybe windows if you want, or even write on your walls, some markers. And our job is just to ask people what's on their mind with what's going on right now. And our job is just to set the scene, say, I just want to hear, as an owner and as the leadership team in this practice, just want to hear what's going on for everyone here. And it just starts with, what do you feel like expressing? What's on your mind about what's going on right now? And our job is for everyone else just to hear what each of us has on our mind. And we start with one person. We'll go round, ourselves last. We put it on the board. And then we go, what else? And we do it again. Write it on the board. Then we do what else? Go around again until no one has anything left to say. And we preface the whole thing with, I just want to hear today. There's no solution today. I just want to hear. And that initial conversation will let a lot of air out of the bag. A lot of the pent up sort of fear, concern, frustration, whatever people have. That will allow us to capture it in one place. There's some magic in writing it down somewhere and in a way that people see it. And then our job is to set a cadence of follow-up and set our direction based on what comes out. Because now we're no longer assuming the conversations you were worried about or the things you were worried about people asking about, etc. They'll ask, but they're going to have those conversations anyway. And so getting it out means you start to see and get an idea of what the pattern looks like in your practice. And then you need to set a cadence of follow-up. But the key is just really putting a must in the ground, and then also saying we need to be adaptive in this setting, and I want to hear this so that we can decide and start to think about what's next. And here, this is where some of the things we've talked about today, if they're relevant, you might raise in that setting as well if your team don't. And hearing their reactions and feedback to each of those things as well, if they haven't raised them, will be useful for you, because it will be a guide as to, they tell you how you need to lead pretty much, because by hearing them, you'll know the ideas, the concerns, expectations, just like the patients that people have. And then you can start to mold your response, not reaction, your response as a practice and a business to those challenges. And that's how you rise to the challenge.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is really important for owners here is you got to wear the right hat for this conversation. So when you're in a consult, you're often directive and advice driven, and that is not the hat to take into this. So you need to be in a resourceful state before you start, and it is discovery mode only. So the only things you can say, tell me more. Can you expand on that? Anything else? You cannot defend yourself or take anything personally, even if it is personal. You just need to, they say, Todd is poor at communicating. Then you write on the board, Todd is poor at communicating. And you say, anything else? Can you tell me more about that? At no point do you defend your role or the role of the clinic or somebody else on the team. You just need to get everyone's thoughts out, and you might need to say to your leadership team, please just share everything on your mind and do not take anything personally. It's really important that this is a safe space and people can share exactly what's on their minds, judgment-free. So you might set the scene, this is judgment-free. We're not going to come back to anybody about anything they say, but we do want to hear precisely what you're thinking, because if we're going to base our solutions on what everyone's told us today and we don't hear something, then our solutions will be less than they could be. And so giving everybody power to do that, not everybody will be able to make it. So you want some way of capturing and sharing what everybody said, and then offering people asynchronous feedback, just so, like Sachin said, you get it all out. There's no kind of things that people have held back. And then when you go into, you might need to do more than one round of this before you actually get to the solution phase. And you really want to just solve one thing at a time. So ideally what you do is, pick the highest value areas to work on, and then really collaboratively. As an owner, this is a bit I struggle with, Sachin. There's a thing from Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which is adding unnecessary value. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there can easily be this kind of vibe about, as a doctor and an owner, wanting to appear smart or that you know things. Can you chat a bit about that in the context of Marshall's book?
Yeah. So there's the adding value. So you always want to jump with a solution or help people. But I think the key here is, I think of it as vessel and mirror. You're a vessel from their mouth to the whiteboard or blackboard, if you still have such a thing. And then you're a mirror, which is you're just reflecting back to them what they said to make sure you captured it correctly. And so in Marshall Goldsmith's book, he talks about you often get to where you are because you've been a bit smarter than other people and willing to work a bit harder and then maybe a bit directive. But the issue with that is that sometimes people don't want your help or your solution. They just want to be heard. And so this exercise is specifically just about, the only purpose of this is that people should leave the room feeling that I was able to say whatever I needed to say and more, because I had other ideas, and no one blocked anything from being said. They heard me, they understood me, and I have full faith that that's going to be taken into consideration and followed up. It doesn't mean it's going to be acted on. It means it's going to be taken into consideration. And so those are probably the key things, I'd say.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Sachin. What other changes do practices need to look at making just so that they're ready for what's already here and what's about to come?
Yeah, so I think particularly for, both bulk billing and maybe a bit less for private billing, but I think it'll be both, is you've got to think about where your big cost sinks are. And so I think the treatment room is definitely one of those. And so if you have got pressures on you, you just need to think about where money's going out the door. We know from the work we've done that most treatment rooms lose between $70,000 and $200,000 a year. And if you think of solving that, it's almost like adding multiple GPs at the billing level. So I think that's one thing. And then I think in a collaborative way with our people, we need to think about altering work patterns. So even just facilitating those conversations, like, is there lift share available? Can you come in together? Is there, depending on your location, do we all do a cycle to work thing? Like, those types of things might be an opportunity to turn things onto a cultural advantage. Then we might think about work from home, who actually physically must be in the practice and who could potentially not have to come in. And then, more extreme, well, not extreme, but more adaptations we might look at working hours. Like, are there ways we can bunch up all the physical stuff into one tidy sort of pile where everyone comes in and then the rest is done remotely? That might be necessary down the track. We don't know yet. And then the other types of things, there are efficiencies that can be derived depending on what booking systems you use and payment systems you use. You may be able to, if people want to earn a bit more or work a bit differently, you may absolutely be able to offer telehealth at sort of what might originally seem weird times. It still allows prepayment to be taken online, no receptionist required. The patient dials in, doctor dials in, and it's bang, without a middle person required. And so some of those things I think are absolutely possible and doable. And it might be the time to just do a couple of choice experiments with those things. Even if you as an owner might do it, just, open up a couple of appointments for one evening just to check it, see how it all works without human in the loop, just to start to lay some very basic, MVP, we call it, minimum viable product, in case you need to make a move. And again, the opportunity in this is, even if, a deterioration in the current situation doesn't show and doesn't happen, it might be a new way of working that people may find actually suits them. And so I think it's useful to have experimentation in mind with the current situation, but also know that necessity is the mother of invention. So by doing that, you may actually discover a new working pattern that may suit some of your people. And if you've, particularly if you're at capacity with the physical building, etc., it might give you new ways to expand without expanding your physical footprint. So those are some of the things I'd be thinking about. How about you?
Yeah, I think same, Sachin. I think the way I think about this is just tiered responses. Some of the stuff I would just be looking at, what can I deploy with any change to investment, and as you say, be relatively easy to test, a few hours either in the evening or on weekends, and make it really clear that you're there to serve people. You're going to offer it telehealth. That way they don't need to travel, and be really clear about what has triggered the new offering. You might need to make some system upgrades for this to be as seamless as it could be, with soft phones that move with the doctor or the reception/admin support, so that they can work from anywhere. And then again, just testing each layer. And I think what people should do is just try one change at a time until they feel like they've mastered that, and then lock down the next change. Changing too many things at once can be really stressful. Staff rostering is probably a really easy one as well. And you might have to talk to your GPs about that as well, and just say, hey, look, this is likely to be a bigger cost for you. Would you prefer to alter your working hours? The main alteration is going to be that people do longer shifts on less days. So you just literally save commuting costs, and potentially come in on days when the traffic is not as much. So you might have more people wanting to work Saturday or a Sunday because the commute time is halved and their return is higher, just because people are prepared to pay more on weekends. So mixed billing clinics will often be fully private billing on the weekend. Just being really intentional about the work that you do, I think, is going to be important. What I'd encourage GPs to do is, if you've got a financial goal, and I think people always should have a financial goal, what you want to earn for the year, and it has to be adjusted upwards because of inflationary costs. Just be clear on what you need to do to get that increase in requirement, and then just commit to doing it. It would be nice to sort of think that you could do nothing else and still be okay, but that's just not the reality, right? And it's a real privilege and luxury that you do have a linear relationship with work. So you're not an employee, so you're not capped by the regulations if you're part-time, casual, whatever. You are autonomous and you can choose what you want to do. And then your job is to serve your patients second to none, so that they would not choose to go to Noctors and Foctors and other places. The more you're around, the more you're available via different channels, then again, you're going to have more comprehensive 360-degree care. That's just better. We know that's better, longitudinal care. So it's a really good opportunity to lean into that, find out what your community need, and then put your hand up to provide it when it meets your needs as well. I'm certainly not suggesting that people get in and start doing work that is below the rate that they should be getting paid. They should make sure that they protect their kind of hourly rate. I'm not suggesting that you sacrifice your expertise here, but I am also suggesting that you get ready for what is likely to be a very real period of hardship for many, and that you can get ahead of it a bit somewhat with addressing the problems that are going to arise in your community, in looking after the people in the way that they need in this time.
Absolutely. And so I think the main message, we'll reiterate: number one, communicate with your team, a whiffle, as Todd talked about, as we walk through, communicate with patients. It's hard, and just keep up that communication so they know exactly how you're modifying or changing or adapting to help them. Support, which is, again, by keeping your finger on the pulse with your team, with your community, knowing what's going on beyond your four walls. And then outreach. I think, we must never forget that we are the best placed to keep the bulk of patients healthy and safe, especially with preventative health work. And it's easy to lose sight of that when we're going through challenges. My wish for all of us is that we really, really diligent about the outreach. And, even if your practice stops one person having that experience that my wife's uncle had, it's worth it at the end of the day. That's why we all exist. And I think that's the overriding message: is we are here to serve. We are best placed to serve our communities and our patients. And this is our time to show it, because we're also the most innovative with that. And so, let's go do our good work in whatever way that's necessary, and just be sensible about the way we think about it in organizing ourselves to provide it. That's what I got to say, Todd.
Awesome, Sachin. Really appreciate your wisdom on this today. And so this has been the episode of Geopolitical Risks in Case of Emergency Break Glass. We will put the 2 episodes we talked about in the show notes. That's how to address the GP that's asking for a higher percentage or higher retention, and also how to make your treatment room profitable. There could be a hidden $100,000, $200,000 turnaround right there for you. That might be enough to give you the buffer you need to ride this out. We've been Todd and Sachin. Go well. See you on the next Scum My Clinic podcast. Thank you, Sachin.
Thanks, Todd.